you all here today on this Memorial Day weekend. We continue our series called This Is Your Backstory. And what we're going to learn, guys, is that in today's Bible passage, we see the effects of what happened when people don't follow directions. And we see the effects of what happens when people are impatient. So kids, raise your hand. Tell me what the word impatient means. Impatient. What does impatient mean, Taylor? You're not patient at all. You can't wait for something to happen or for you to do something. And so we're going to see that illustrated today. And so I thought we'd play a little game show today. The game show today is called RedArrow Ministries Top Chef. Now maybe you've seen some of those cooking competitions on television. So we have 3 chefs that have been working tirelessly for a perfect dessert. So I need 3 judges to be taste testers that don't have any food allergies. Okay? 1, 2, 3. Come on. Alright, so come on up here. Alright. Very good, very good. Alright, why don't you stand right in the middle, okay, bud? Alright, so here, have a seat, have a seat. And so let's start with Chef number 1. Chef number 1 has been working tirelessly to create this wonderful delicacy. Maybe you've heard of it before. It's called Jell-O. Do we have any Jell-O fans here today? Yes, okay. So what you're going to do is take one of your spoons, and I want you guys to taste test Chef number 1. So go ahead, grab a spoon, go ahead and taste. That doesn't look right at all. Go ahead, guys. I know it's scary. Go ahead. That doesn't look like Jell-O at all. Go ahead, try it. What do you think?
I think it's water.
I don't think it looks right at all. I don't know what happened here. Chef number 1, you just stand there for a minute. That's just a train wreck. Let's try chef number 2. Let's try chef number 2. She too is going to be a student this fall, and she's going into culinary school, so she's been working hard. Let's go ahead. Let's try it. Pick a different spoon now, guys, and go ahead and try chef number. What the world? Go ahead and taste test it. It's frozen, look at this. I can't, chef number 2, they can't even taste test that. What is going on here? This is just terrible. Let's try chef number 3. Chef number 3 is also, she's now a student at Western, and she's been working really hard on today's dessert for the judges here. So go ahead, let's try this. Chef number 3. So use a different spoon this time. Go ahead and dig in and try it. Go ahead.
It's Jell-O.
Go ahead. Go ahead, dig in there, Dee. Oh, it's okay, it wiggles. Good job.
It's a bite.
Yeah, it's the right one. Got it? Go ahead and taste it. Good job. All right, judges. Who should win Red Arrow's Top Chef? Should it be judge number 1?
Yeah.
No. Chef number 2, I mean. How about chef number 3? So kids, you stay up here. Think about this a minute. Kids, raise your hand and tell me, what do you think went wrong with chef number 1? What do you think?
I think water.
I know, but what do you think happened? What went wrong?
Water.
Hey, well, water's in the directions. Let's look at the directions. Michael, if we can turn around. Add what? Do you think you know, Taylor? Yeah.
All we do is mix it, heat it.
Oh, let's see here. It says add boiling water to gelatin. Stir for 2 minutes, 1 cup. Refrigerate for 4 hours. Did you wait 4 hours before you took it off? 5 minutes!
Lazy.
No, he's not lazy. I don't know where to go with that. No, he's impatient. He couldn't wait the 4 hours in the refrigerator. And it says here refrigerate. Chef number 2, did you just put yours in the freezer instead?
Yeah, I should have read the directions.
She should have read the directions. So kids, what we're going to see today is that when you don't follow the directions and you're very impatient, clearly it never turns out right. In the same way, like Abraham and Sarah refused to remember God's instructions and tried to take matters into their own hands, it kind of turned into a train wreck. So that's what we're going to be listening to today. Let's give all of our participants a round of applause. Good. So, you guys can grab a piece of candy before you return to your seats. Good job. Harper's got one as well. So kids, if you attend preschool through 1st grade, you can head to Rest Stop with your parents or grandparents' permission. That'd be great. Everyone else, if you you can open up your Bibles to the book of Genesis. That's where we're going to be today. Genesis chapter 21. Good job listening, guys. Awesome. Helping out your siblings. If you're a guest with us today, thank you so much for being here on this Memorial Day weekend. We're excited that you're here. We are in the middle of our summer sermon series, talking about This Is Your Backstory. Over the Lent season, we saw how the main story of all of history is the perfect life, the atoning death, and the victorious resurrection of Jesus. But for us to fully understand why that's the main story, we first have to look at the backstory, all of the story that came before the main story. And so the last couple of weeks we've been looking at different characters, and last Sunday we were outside for Ascension Sunday, but the Sunday before that we met Abraham and Sarah, who had 0 children at the time, and yet God promised them to look up at the stars in the sky, so too will your descendants be. But in the very next chapter, in chapter 16, Abraham and Sarah couldn't be patient. They couldn't wait any longer, and so we see what happened. If we could please see that, Michael. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I could build a family through her." So foolishly, Abraham agreed to what Sarah said. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress, Sarah. What a mess. Now, even though Hagar was soon driven out into the wilderness, the Lord protected her and her unborn son, who would be named Ishmael. And Ishmael means God hears. In today's passage, we will see what happens when Ishmael, who was about 13 at the time, the firstborn of Abraham, comes into direct conflict with his younger half-brother, the son of promise, named Isaac. So keep that in mind as we look at today's main passage together, starting with verse 1, where we see, "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said. And the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. And so Abraham gave him the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." She added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." And so this child, he grew and was weaned. And on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held this great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your maidservant. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make a son of the maidservant into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Now early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, sent her on her shoulders, and sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. But when the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes, went off and sat down nearby, about a bow shot away, for she thought, "I cannot watch the boy die." She sat there nearby and began to sob. Yet God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up, take him by the hand, and I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went, and she filled the skin with water, and gave the boy a drink. And so God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. And while he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. All throughout the Old Testament, there are lessons to be learned that God says, "This is what I'm going to do." And God's people are then left to wait. and to be patient and to trust that God was going to do what he said he was going to do, even when it takes time. And we see this on display in today's passage, where this whole passage should be just a sign and a celebration of God keeping his promises. And yet the story is tainted, is colored, because Abraham and Sarah couldn't be patient. They couldn't trust God to keep his promise, and so they took matters into their own hands. And yet, as Abraham is 100, Sarah's in her 90s, we see finally the time came. Verse 1. The Lord was gracious. Literally, the Lord visited Sarah. Remember, she's in her 90s. There's no physical way she could get pregnant. In fact, for her entire life, she has not been able to have any children. And so God had to intervene. And so we see this God visiting her and creating a miracle. And sure enough, 3 times the text says he did what God had said he was going to do. The Lord did for Sarah, second time, what he had promised. And sure enough, a miracle. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. There it is. At the very time God had promised him. God said he was going to do it. He promised he would do it. And if they would only have remained patient, it would have turned out okay. But here, this son was born. Abraham gave him the name Isaac. Now, the name Isaac means he laughs. If you remember why, Sarah and Abraham, very old, and like God said to him, you're going to have kids. And they're like, that's a good one, God. No way that's going to happen. We're too old. But notice that is the name he was given, Isaac, for he laughs. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him. Remember, that was a sign of the covenant, as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac. Can you imagine, right? Grandparents, great-grandparents, right? Can you imagine being a parent at age 100? I mean, that would be exhausting. Yet nothing is too powerful for God not to intervene. And sure enough, we see the camera then turn to Sarah. Now, in the ancient world, unfortunately, a woman's value was tied to her ability to have children. And so you can imagine, for Sarah's entire life, she was mocked, she was ridiculed, she was made fun of. And yet now, in her 90s, the Lord did something amazing. So before she was laughing in disbelief, she now says, God has brought me laughter. In other words, she has brought me the joy of laughter. And everyone who hears about this will laugh, not at me, but now with me. She added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I had borne him a son in his old age. Now, it would be great if the whole passage ended with the next verse, in the second section, verse 8. The child grew and was weaned. Now, this was unusual because in the ancient world, infant mortality was very high. Very few infants grew past the age of 3, and it was very sad. And so when a child reached around age 3 and was weaned, this was a thing to celebrate. So here we sing happy birthday to Addison. We are thankful for her. But again, in that culture, you celebrated the child surviving infancy. And so they had this huge, great feast. And I'm going to admit, it would be great if the passage just ended now and we could all go about our Memorial Day weekend and say, hey, God loves you. See ya. But no. Let's just be brutally honest that what follows the rest of this passage is something out of a Jerry Springer show. It is a mess because God told them to do one thing one way. He gave them directions, and yet Abraham and Sarah took matters into their own hands and were impatient. So at this great feast that's supposed to be a time of celebration, Sarah looks over and sees the son, Ishmael, whom Hagar the Egyptian had born to Abraham, and he starts mocking his little half-brother. Okay? So Dad, you're going to be a 3-year-old. Can you do that for me? Okay? So Ishmael's about 13. Isaac is about 3. And this is what Ishmael said. You little dog, you're not going to amount to nothing. Oh, look at his little thing with the nose and the whole thing like that. Now again, if someone was making fun of a 3-year-old, you would be kind of upset. And so Sarah saw this, and again, it's quite ironic, right? If Isaac's name is he laughed, now Ishmael is laughing mockingly at Isaac. Sarah sees that as a threat. Clearly, Ishmael is making fun of his little half-brother, and she says to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance of my son, Isaac. Imagine how Abraham's feeling. He cares for Ishmael, his son. He cares for Isaac, his 3-year-old son. He cares for his wife Sarah, has feelings for Hagar. What's he going to do? How is he supposed to get in through this messy train wreck of a situation? Thankfully, God intervenes again. And then the Lord says to Abraham, do not be so distressed about the boy. Listen to what Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac your offspring will be reckoned. Now, what does that mean, will be reckoned? In Hebrew there, it's basically, he will be named. He will be given notoriety. So kind of, when we saw 2 weeks ago that the stars in the heaven, that his descendants would not come through Ishmael, but the covenant promises are those through Isaac, and then later his son Jacob, and of course the 12 tribes. But look what God says. I will make the son of the maidservant into a nation. So you have the nation of Israel that the Lord's going to bless. But you're also going to now have the nation that comes out of Ishmael, who we know today as many of the Arab nations around the world. And so sure enough, early the next morning, Abraham took some food in a skin of water, gave it to Hagar, sent him out with the boy, and she went and wandered in the desert. Now we have to ask, if Abraham truly cared about Ishmael, his son, why did he only give him just a little bit of food and just one container of water to go wandering in the desert with no shelter? And so most scholars believe that Abraham was hoping once they ran out of food and water, they would come back. And they would be one big, happy, dysfunctional family. But what we see here is while they're out in the desert, the water is gone. You can see this 13-year-old just completely dehydrated and starving, going through the desert. And so he starts to moan in his agony. The mother then, literally in Hebrew, says she shoved Ishmael into some bushes and then went about a bow's shot away, because as a mother she couldn't bear to hear her son groaning the pangs of death. And then of course she sat there and began to sob. What a terrible thing. Who in the world would ever bring this up on Memorial Day weekend? I don't know. But did you notice? God does something. What was Ishmael's name mean? It means God hears. And sure enough, verse 17. God heard the boy crying. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said, what's the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. Why? God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift him up, take him by the hand, and I will make him not just a nation, I'm going to make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water, gave the boy to drink. And then in a wonderful example of what we know as common grace, God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert, became an archer, an expert with a bow and arrow, and while he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him in Egypt. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out a few things at the end of this passage. Can we see that map, please? Can we see that map, please? It's okay, Mike already knows what's coming here. But take a look at this. We think that the desert of Paran is sort of this northeast side of the Sinai Peninsula, sort of northeast from Mount Sinai, kind of a little bit by where it says the Gulf of Suez, kind of like right over there. And you're saying, well, then why is that important? That's where Ishmael landed. Well, if we superimpose a modern day map, we see that's where modern day Mecca is, the holy city of the Muslim faith. And so I have to be really careful here, because not all scholars agree, but there is great evidence that one of Ishmael's descendants was Muhammad, who started the Islamic faith. And so when you watch the news and you see the animosity between the modern day nation of Israel and many of its Arab nations, and you're like, why do they hate each other? What we need to understand is the animosity has been going on for centuries. And it's not going to go away overnight. But there are people who are trying to work for peace. I was reminded this week, Bill and Jan gave me this book a year ago, and I read it and kind of disappeared in my office. But I found it, and I'm going to give it back to them. It's a great book called Blood Brothers. And it's the unforgettable story of a Palestinian Christian working for peace in Israel. So there are people, even today in the Middle East, trying to reconcile the tribe of Israel and the promise that they received from God, but this other great nation that came from Ishmael, that many of the Arabic nations. And again, when you watch the news and you say, well, why is there so much violence? Why is there so much animosity? You could look to today's passage as really the first time where these two brothers entered into conflict with each other. And so, in conclusion, as you think back to the children's sermon a moment, how many of you like Jell-O again? Just by a show of hands. How many of you like lime Jell-O? Yeah, I think you're the biggest service that like, there was somebody in the last service is like, ew. Who doesn't like lime Jell-O? Don't even go there, Tim. My wife, she makes it for me because she knows I like it. But when you think of the children's sermon, right? When you think of chef number 1, I mean, are you kidding me? 5 minutes, chef number 1? There's no way. How impatient can you be? Clearly on the directions, it said, wait 4 hours. And in the same way in today's text, God said, I'm going to give you a child, but you have to wait. In my perfect timing, just wait. And what happened? Abraham and Sarah took matters into their own hands. They were impatient. And we see just like this, chef number 1, it was a big mess. But we also see chef number 2 didn't read the directions very carefully, right? And it was actually frozen because she read refrigerator and she thought it said freezer. I mean, you can't even taste test this. In the same way that this is as hard as a rock, we saw in today's passage how Ishmael's heart had been hardened against his little half-brother. And as a result, he and his mom were cast out of the family. But in the same way, chef number 1, if he would have just put this back in the fridge and got a second chance, he could have participated in the competition. And in the same way, chef number 2, if we wait and let this defrost, maybe the judges could do that. And for us, God gives us second and third and fourth chances, even when we don't listen to the directions, and even when we are impatient. And what we know is sometimes when people have a hardened heart, it takes a lot of time for that to thaw. It takes a lot of time for God to soften their hearts. And so finally we saw with chef number 3 that when she followed the directions and when she was patient, I'm not going to eat it because I have to sing in a minute. But what we saw was it turned out just right. And so when we think about our life today, we know that God's people are a waiting people. For centuries they had to wait for another son of promise, who we know is Jesus. And we know he lived the perfect life, and he gave us his sacrifice of the atoning death on the cross, and he victoriously rose from the grave. And right now, as we saw last week, he's physically seated at the right hand of God the Father, ascended as our King. And he said to us he would come back just like he left. And so we're still waiting. We're called to be patient. We don't know when he's going to come back. I put a Facebook post on the line saying that I watched the news, and again, lately I've been praying, Lord, come quickly. It's hard to watch this. And yet, he calls us to wait. And he calls us to pray. And we know that he could come back at any time, but while we wait for him, we should be praying that we have a hunger for his word. We should be praying that we have a hunger for fellowship with other Christians. We should be praying that we have a hunger to worship him in spirit and truth, so that when he returns, he finds us. Not being impatient and trying to take matters into our own hands, but following the directions that he's given us. To trust in his word, because God always keeps his promises. Please pray with me. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day, and I thank you for Jell-O. I thank you that you give us fun stuff like this in our life to enjoy. But Lord, thank you for this illustration that we see how Abraham and Sarah were given the directions, and yet they were impatient. And they took matters into their own hands. And just like that Jell-O, it was a mess in their family because of it. But Lord, thankfully you give us second and third and fourth chances to get it right. And so Lord, if there's anyone here today that maybe needs a second chance, or a third chance, or a fourth chance, or a fifth or sixth, Lord, let this be the day that they begin to follow your directions. That they begin to trust at your word and be patient for you to move in their lives, so that they too have a hunger for your word, a hunger for fellowship, and a hunger for worshiping you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.